On December 7, 1941, when Floridians learned of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in the Hawaiian Islands, few could imagine the impact the war was to have on their state. Large numbers of military personnel would soon swarm to the peninsula. Before the Japanese attack, Florida had 8 military installations. By the end of the conflict, it would have more than 170. Additionally, civilian workers would come to work in the various camps, bases, and shipyards and other industries that expanded during the conflict. The war united Americans in a way never before seen. Furious at what most called a sneak attack on Hawaii, and the subsequent declarations of war by Germany and Italy, Americans were overwhelmingly united in the war effort. Tens of thousands of men and women enlisted in the weeks and months that followed, while others were drafted into military service. Pearl Harbor initiated the greatest military and economic effort in the nation's history and began changes that would greatly affect both Florida and the United States as a whole. Military training in Florida. Florida's strategic location made the state vital for national defense. Planes and ships from Florida's bases helped protect the sea lanes in the Atlantic Ocean, Gulf of Mexico, and the Caribbean. The state was thus viewed as an important first line of defense for the southern United States, the Caribbean Basin, and the Panama Canal. During the war years, military installations in Florida increased from 8 to more than 170. For the Army, Camp Blanding near Stark became one of the largest training bases in the southeastern United States, while Camp Gordon Johnston at Carrabelle served as a major amphibious training center. Army Air Force bases included Valparaiso's Eglin Field, Drew and MacDill Airfields at Tampa, Dale Mabry Field at Tallahassee, Buckingham and Page Airfields at Hawaii, Panama City's Tyndall Army Airfield, and Army Airfield Avon Torque, Boca Raton, Homestead, Sarasota, and Venice. Civilian contractors trained 14,000 cadet pilots, including many from Great Britain, at Lakeland and Avon Park from 1940 to 1945. Major naval bases or naval air stations were established or expanded at Daytona Beach, DeLand, Fort Lauderdale, Green Cove Springs, Jacksonville, and Pensacola, Richmond, Sanford, and Vero Beach. At Fort Pierce, some 150,000 Navy, Marine Corps, and Army personnel passed through the amphibious training. Even the Coast Guard and its female auxiliary, the Spars, established a training center in St. Augustine. Aviation. The most dramatic example of an increased military presence in Florida during World War II was the large number of Army airfields and naval air stations that were established in the state. Florida's climate, which allowed for year-round training, certainly contributed to its popularity. Perhaps more Navy and Army Air Force pilots and their crews were trained in Florida than in any other state, and many pilots from allied nations also received instruction. Unfortunately, hundreds of student pilots lost their lives in training accidents. So many crashes occurred at airfields in the Tampa Bay area that a common expression among the flyers was "one a day in Tampa Bay." Established in 1914, the Naval Air Station Pensacola had long been considered the cradle of naval aviation. During World War II, some 28,000 naval aviators received training at Pensacola and its auxiliary fields. In the 1930s, the Army began building a modest facility in the Florida Panhandle that would evolve into Eglin Army Airfield, one of the largest installations of its kind. Eglin Field served as an aircraft armament proving ground and a research and development facility during World War II. In 1942, Army Air Force Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle trained his pilots at Eglin for their dramatic bombing raid on Japan's capital, Tokyo. Established in 1940, Jacksonville Naval Air Station became one of the 3 largest air stations in the world by the end of the war, with a complement of 1 planes. Orlando Army Airfield was established in late 1940, initially as a base to train American pilots in enemy technology and tactics. Later in the war, B-29 Super Fortress bomber crews were training at the facility. An officers' candidate school in Miami turned out thousands of 90-day wonders, the nickname for men who received commissions in the Army Air Force after only 3 months of training. Homestead Army Airfield was established in 1942 as a departure point for aircraft being shipped overseas, and as a facility to train transport crews. Land warfare. During the course of World War II, perhaps as many as 800,000 servicemen passed through Camp Blanding. Located near Stark in northeast Florida, Camp Blanding trained more men than any other training facility in the state. Many units and individuals who helped win the war against Germany, Italy, and Japan learned tactics in Camp Blanding swamps and piney woods. In the late 1930s, the State Armory Board selected a new training site for the Florida National Guard in Clay County. It consisted of some 30,000 acres and was named after Major General Albert Blanding. Initial construction at the site began in 1939 with facilities built to accommodate several thousand troops. This increased dramatically in 1940 to 1941 with the mobilization of the National Guard. The government purchased or leased 140,000 additional acres, making Camp Blanding one of the largest facilities of its kind. During the war, 9 infantry divisions and a variety of other units trained here. During the conflict's later stages, the camp served as an infantry replacement training center. This program trained soldiers to serve as individual replacements in infantry units that lost troops in combat. After the war, Camp Blanding would again be used as a training base for the Florida National Guard. Although Camp Blanding served as the main infantry training location in Florida, other bases, including Camp Gordon Johnston, instructed troops in various land warfare skills. Amphibious training. Tens of thousands of soldiers trained in beach landings, or amphibious operations, at Camp Gordon Johnston, which was located on the Gulf Coast 60 miles southwest of Tallahassee. The 38th, 28th, and the 4th Infantry Divisions trained there in 1942 to 1943. Living conditions at Camp Gordon Johnston were particularly crude. Most of the troops lived in tents or prefabricated barracks with sand floors. Hazards included snakes, wild hogs, mosquitoes, sand fleas, flies, and chiggers. General Omar Bradley, who commanded the 28th Division while it trained at Gordon Johnston, later stated, "The man who selected that has been court-martialed for stupidity." In September 1943, Camp Gordon Johnston was designated an Army Service Forces Training Center. For the next 2 years, small boat crews and amphibian truck companies trained at camp on the revolutionary amphibious vehicle called the Duck, which proved invaluable during the European and Pacific campaigns. Realizing that amphibious operations would play a major role in both Europe and the Pacific, U.S. Navy officials established a major amphibious training base at Fort Pierce in early 1943. About 15,000 Army, Navy, and Marine personnel. This included elite units of scouts, raiders, rangers, and underwater demolition teams or frogmen. These units spearheaded the invasions in both theaters of the war. WAC training at Daytona Beach. In September 1939, Pensacola native Jacqueline Cochran wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt to introduce the proposal of starting a women's flying division in the Army Air Forces. She felt that qualified women pilots could do all the domestic, non-combat aviation jobs necessary to release more male pilots for combat. The WASPs took over non-combat flying jobs, especially ferrying aircraft between air bases as needed. This would free up male pilots for combat missions. Cochrane herself was an accomplished pilot, and would eventually find herself in command of over 1,000 female aviators. She would direct the newly created Women Air Force Service Pilots, or simply WASPs. The military was still segregated at this time. African Americans were drafted and encouraged to enlist in the armed forces, but they were assigned to all-black units, lived in separate quarters, and served almost exclusively in non-combat SWAT roles like driving, cleaning, and moving supplies from place to place. By the end of the war, however, many more African Americans were serving in combat roles. Some even served as fighter pilots. However, this was only attained after black leaders pressured the Roosevelt administration to order the changes. The German U-boat threat. At the outbreak of war, the Navy Department had just a handful of ships and planes to defend the entire coast from Maine to Texas. This small force proved totally inadequate to deal with the U-boat offensive launched against America by German submarines. Over the first 7 months of 1942, the Germans sank nearly 400 vessels, including more than 35 ships off Florida. The most dramatic sinking in Florida waters took place the night of April 10, 1942, when U-123 torpedoed the tanker Gulfmare of Jacksonville Beach. The resulting fiery explosion was clearly seen on shore, and curious crowds gathered to view the ship's destruction, and looked on in shock as the German submarine surfaced and fired its deck gun at the tanker. In response to the Gulf America sinking, in which 19 crew members were lost, Governor Spessard Holland ordered a blackout of lights that could be seen might silhouette passing ships, civil defense and civil patrols. Although nearly 250,000 Floridians served in the armed forces, the majority of the population fought the battle on the home front. In his address to the state legislature in 1943, Florida Governor Spessard Holland made a call to Floridians to join in the civil defense of the state. By the end of 1943, more than 300,000 Floridians would volunteer for a variety of civilian defense activities. These citizens served as air raid wardens, airplane spotters, and civil defense wardens. Civilian yacht owners formed coastal patrol organizations that aided the Coast Guard in patrolling the thousands of miles of unprotected beaches. The Civil Air Patrol, a civilian arm of the Army Air Force, came into being in December 1941. The Civil Air Patrol provided valuable war-related service, from hunting for German submarines off the coast to locating downed military pilots. It also supervised an extensive cadet program that provided military and aviation training to teenagers. In 1940, Tampa resident Guy Allen organized a unit known as the Motorcycle Defense Troops. The motorcyclists escorted military convoys throughout the state and performed other civil defense-related activities. Saboteurs. Florida became the scene of a bizarre plot in June 1942 when 4 saboteurs came ashore from German submarine U-584 near Ponte Vedra Beach. They buried boxes of explosives and other equipment in the dunes for future use. The men then boarded a bus for Jacksonville, before splitting into 2 groups that traveled to New York and Chicago. The agents were to join with 4 other saboteurs, who had landed on New York's Long Island, and then planned to bomb key railroads, bridges, and factories producing goods for the war. Fortunately, one of the New York band had misgivings about his mission and surrendered them to the FBI. By June 27, all of the men had been apprehended. A military court later tried the 8 Germans and found them guilty of spying. 6 of the spies, including all of the Florida group, were executed. Wartime rationing and shortages. Because war materials and food were needed by the military for the war effort, and some foreign sources of supply were disrupted by the way civilians do with less. In early 1942, rubber became the first item to be rationed by the federal government. By 1943, gas rationing became severe, with all forms of pleasure driving declared illegal. Some consumers were limited to only 3 or 4 gallons of gas per week. Because of driving restrictions, Floridians turned to public transportation, particularly trains, for long-distance travel. The rationing of food had great impact on the lives of average Floridians. The federal government issued ration books authorizing the purchase of specified amounts of various products per week. Beginning in April 1942, sugar was rationed, followed by coffee, meats, canned goods, and a variety of other products. Though most Floridians tried to abide by the often confusing government regulations, a thriving black market developed. Tallahassee newspaperman Malcolm Johnson later recalled, "There was a lot of favoritism. If you were a good customer, the butcher had something for you that didn't show in the case. And the filling station could find a way to give you more gas and new tires." Scrap metal drives. Faced with a shortage of metal at the beginning of the war, the U.S. government mounted an aggressive campaign to collect scrap steel, brass, aluminum, and other valuable metals. Songs such as Junk Will when the war became popular as Floridians collected scrap items as diverse as lead toy soldiers, pots and pans, shovels, light fixtures, oil, tin cans, a steam engine, and even a German artillery piece. By war's end, scrap drives had accounted for a large proportion of the steel, tin and other metals used in defense industries. Victory Gardens. A national government effort also encouraged the planting of victory gardens to increase vegetable production for home consumption. Organizations like the Civilian Voluntary Services promoted this activity, which proved enormously popular, particularly in states like Florida with long growing seasons. Eventually, some 20 million victory gardens dotted the nation, producing 40% of all wartime vegetables. The growing of victory gardens also increased civilian morale and contributed to a sense of participation in the war effort. Kids pitch in. America's children played a contributing role in the nation's war effort. Youth groups like the Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, 4-H clubs, the Junior Red Cross, and the Junior Commandos mobilized American youth. Nationally, patriotic children purchased war stamps and bonds worth more than $1 billion. They took part in scrap drives, collecting metal and rubber, as well as stacks of old newspapers and magazines for recycling. As metal and rubber became scarce, children made do with wooden toys. They also built airplane models used to train military personnel and aircraft identification. War games became popular, and most children's books and comics were filled with war-related themes. For many children, World War II also was marked by periods of separation from fathers who were serving in the armed forces and mothers who were long hours in war industries. Financing the war. To help finance the war, the federal government raised taxes, which included the implementation of payroll withholding tax deductions, and mounted a campaign to encourage the purchase of war bonds and war stamps. A series of war bond drives took place during the war, with government officials and Hollywood actors and entertainers urging even greater participation. Ultimately, Americans purchased some $135 billion in bonds ranging in value from $25 to $10,000. Florida, even with its relatively small population, still purchased more than $145 million in war bonds and stamps by 1943. New roles for women on the home front. World War II provided a catalyst for improved economic, social, and political conditions among American women. This prompted demands for even greater advances during the women's rights movement of the post-war years. Women joined the workforce as never before in history, while others raised children and maintained households while waiting for their husbands to return from military service. They kept up the spirits of those serving far from home by sending letters and care packages. Thousands of women and children traveled across the country between military bases as their husbands and fathers were transferred. They fought the battle on the home front, as rationing and shortages of foodstuffs and other products made life increasingly difficult. Many women donated to wartime charities and volunteered in organizations to assist in the war effort. The Florida Federation of Women's Clubs, for example, opened its facilities across the state for Red Cross work and USO events. Members also sponsored scrap drives, promoted the planting of victory gardens, gathered books to distribute among soldiers, and sold war bonds, including the very successful Buy Bomber campaign that raised $3 million. Women on duty. Though denied direct roles in combat, many American women served in the armed services during World War II. With slogans such as "Free a Man to Fight," the government encouraged women to enlist in order to allow more men to serve in combat. In addition to traditional office jobs, women performed as mechanics, truck drivers, air traffic controllers, and in other challenging fields. Some 272,000 women, including many Floridians, joined the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, later simply the Women's Army Corps, or WACS. Women also served in similar organizations in the Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard. Many women served overseas, and a number died on active duty. Army and Navy nurses in particular were praised for their courage and dedication. African Americans. The World War II-era military was segregated by race, with African Americans serving in segregated units. Many African Americans overcame the objections of military leaders and would serve courageously in combat roles. During the war, more than 50,000 black Floridians serviced primarily in the Army and Army Air Force. Hundreds of thousands of other African Americans would pass through the Sunshine State in the course of training. Many Northern blacks who trained in Florida were shocked at the social segregation and the condition of race relations in the state. The more than 500,000 African American civilians living in Florida experienced segregated communities, schools, and restaurants. A notable black ground combat unit was the 92nd Infantry Division, nicknamed the Buffalo Division, based on their shoulder patch and mid-century black soldiers in the American West. The 92 ND Division's enlisted men were all African Americans and were mainly from southern states, including Florida. The unit engaged in bitter combat against the Germans in the Italian campaign during 1944 to 1945. Perhaps the most famous black unit of the war was the 99th Fighter Squadron, one of several units collectively known as the Tuskegee Airmen. Commanded by West Point graduate and future General Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. The unit trained for a time at Dale Mabry Field near Tallahassee. Despite the belief of many whites that African Americans would not perform well in combat, the pilots of the 99th Fighter Squadron went on an outstanding combat record in North Africa and Italy. At least 9 Floridians, including future General Daniel Chappie James, served in the ranks of the famed Tuskegee Airmen. Guarding a massive coastline. The United States Coast Guard, which had been transferred to the command of the U.S. Navy in 1941, was called upon to provide security for Florida's 197-mile-long coastline. In 1942, the Coast Guard Auxiliary established a coastal picket patrol consisting of private vessels either loaned, purchased, or requisitioned by the government. These vessels, which in Florida were part of Coast Guard Auxiliary Flotilla No. 2, were popularly called the Corsair Navy, Mosquito Fleet, or the Hooligan Navy. The ships carried machine guns, radios, and occasionally depth charges. They patrolled along the coast, performing the vital functions of rescuing survivors and reporting sightings of U-boats. As the war progressed, the regular Coast Guard took control of the patrols. In addition to maintaining the Corsair Navy, the Coast Guard implemented beach patrols to defend the coastline. Initially 1 or 2-man foot patrols were implemented, but Coast Guardsmen mounted on horses and in motorized vehicles also were used. Dogs accompanied the men on some coastal patrols. For a time, personnel also staffed watchtowers on the Florida coast. Agriculture. Agriculture was one of Florida's major economic contributions to the war effort, despite the fact that a shortage of agricultural workers threatened to limit Florida's harvests. The U.S. Department of Agriculture eventually authorized the temporary hiring of 75,000 foreign workers, mainly Bahamian Jamaicans, to work in South Florida fields. Cotton, tobacco, and vegetable production all increased during the war, and the Florida sugar crop became particularly important as forests became unavailable. Chemists working in an Orlando laboratory for the U.S. Department of Agriculture conducted experiments with dichlorodiphenyltrichloroethane, or DT, which eventually was used widely as an insecticide to prevent disease and, by the conflicts and, to protect crops. Only years later would its harmful side effects be realized. While Florida agricultural production contributed to the Allied victory in World War II, it did so at a terrible cost, as farm workers often suffered through unhealthy and degrading living and working conditions. The Florida Citrus Commission began an advertising campaign popularizing the state's orange, grapefruit, and tangerine crops. Florida's citrus growers found increased demand for their product during World War II, with much of the orange crop going directly to the government for distribution to the armed forces. Processes for dehydrating citrus juice were developed during the conflict, enabling millions of cans to be sent around the world. Dr. L.G. McDowell of the Florida Citrus Commission and Dr. Arthur Stahl of the University of Florida were responsible for the development of a later frozen concentrate product, which came into full production after the war and was considered a vast improvement over the dehydrated version. Early in the war, the Florida citrus harvest surpassed that of California, and soon became a $100 million industry. The 1945 to 1946 crop topped that of the 1940 to 1941 season by 29 million boxes of fruit. War production. World War II presented economic opportunities for Floridians who had suffered through the Depression of the 1930s. Wages improved, and jobs became plentiful due to the large number of men in service. Women, African Americans, and Hispanics moved into jobs previously dominated by white males. Rosie the Riveter became a symbol for the 6 million American women who entered the workplace for the first time. Women worked in more traditional secretarial roles, as well as at jobs in shipyards, aircraft plants, and other heavy industries, proving they had the ability to perform well in many jobs previously reserved for men. Black Americans, meanwhile, worked for victory overseas against fascism, as well as at home against racial prejudice. Florida's industrial output grew during the war, particularly in the area of shipbuilding and manufacture of war-related equipment and supplies. Liberty ships, patrol torpedo boats, aircraft rescue boats, minesweepers, landing craft, assault boats, and other vessels were built within the state. Florida shipyards included the Tampa Shipbuilding and Engineering Company, the Hookers Point Shipyard in Tampa, the Wainwright Shipyard in Panama City, the St. John Jura Shipyard Company, the Miami Shipbuilding Corporation, the Pensacola Shipyard and Engineering Company, the Shipbuilding Company in Orlando, and other smaller firms. Alligator amphibious vehicles also were designed and produced at Dunedin by Donald Roebling. The military received the first production models shortly before Pearl Harbor. Eventually, more than 15,000 were produced, with most used to land Marines on hostile shores in the Pacific. In addition to shipbuilding and other wartime industries such as armament production, the first commercial oil field in Florida, the Sutherland Field in County, began operations in 1933. Tourism during the war years. Restrictions on travel and a blackout along the coast hurt Florida's tourism industry during the early months of the war. To compensate for the loss of tourist dollars, however, the military took over hotels and restaurants for use as barracks and mess halls. By the end of 1942, for example, more than 70,000 trainees attending various schools run by the Army Air Force were staying in hotel rooms in Miami and Miami Beach. Servicemen were eventually billeted in hotels throughout the state, such as St. Augustine's luxurious Ponce de Leon, while the Women's Army Corps invaded Daytona Beach. Later in the war, the tourist trade returned, with Florida promoting itself as a vacation getaway for hardworking, and now highly paid, civilian workers. In 1943, tourism in Florida increased by 20% over the previous year, and gambling at South Florida racetracks reached all-times. Florida's state government publicized the availability of hotel rooms for civilians, and even secured additional trains to transport tourists. The state's promotion of its tourist industry drew criticism in some quarters for its inappropriateness during a period of national sacrifice, but in general Americans recognized the need for relaxation and recreation, even in time of war. Operation Crossbow. In early 1944, when the Allies discovered unusual structures being built along the coast of German-occupied France, intelligence sources indicated they were launching ramps for German V-1 rockets. Eglin Army Airfield would serve as the site of an unusual series of experiments. These were intended to test the vulnerability of German V-1 rocket launching ramps. To determine the best tactics for destroying the structures, General Hap Arnold ordered the construction of a replica at Eglin Field. Later in 1944, the Allies obtained parts of salvaged rockets, which were brought to the United States and used in construction of a working copy, which became known as the JB-2. Eventually, the U.S. military ordered some 75,000 JB-2s, of which 1,300 were actually produced. Test launches near Destin and on Santa Rosa Island continued from 1944 until 1946. After the war, the U.S. military experimented with captured German V-2 rockets while attempting to develop the first large-scale, liquid-propelled, Toost rocket. Additional missile tests took place at Cape Canaveral over the next several years. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration would later begin operations at Cape Canaveral. Prisoners of war. During World War II, some 378,000 German and Italian captives were sent to prisoner of war camps in the United States. Overall, about 10,000 German prisoners spent time in Florida, and it became a relatively common sight for Floridians to see POWs working on farms or in logging camps. The two major camps housing German prisoners in Florida were Camp Blanding and Camp Gordon Johnston. Some 7,500 prisoners were held at the Blanding compound and surrounding smaller camps. Beginning in March 1944, over 2,500 Axis prisoners were confined at Camp Gordon Johnston and its three branch camps. American military officials adhered to the provisions of the 1929 Geneva Convention, which stipulated that captives must receive singed clothing and housing as the troops of the home nation. Enlisted personnel worked in a variety of positions both inside and outside the camp, while non-commissioned officers performed supervisory functions. Religious services were made available, and prisoners had free time to participate in sports, classroom, or leisure activities. U.S. officials also mounted a re-education campaign to teach the prisoners democratic values. The war ends. By 1944, the war had turned in favor of the Allies. The Americans had advanced deep into the Pacific. The Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe had occurred in June and had successfully liberated France and the Low Countries. Meanwhile, the massive Red Army was bearing down from the east. In the November 1944 state elections, Democrat Millard Caldwell won the governorship. In his opening address to the legislature in April 1945, he emphasized post-war development and economic issues, indicating that many Floridians were already looking forward to the end of the war and to the state's role in the post-war era. The spring of 1945 brought the death of Franklin Roosevelt and also the surrender of Nazi Germany. Floridians joined the country in celebrating Victory in Europe Day on May 8, 1945. Still, Floridians knew that Japan remained to be defeated. Fears of a costly Allied invasion of the Japanese home islands worried citizens and soldiers alike. However, shortly after the explosion of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, Japan agreed to surrender terms. Floridian pilot Paul W. Tibbets piloted the B-29 Enola Gay, which dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Peace comes to the world, announced the Florida Times-Union on VJ Day, August 15, 1945. The Fort Lauderdale News and Evening Sentinel reported the city of Bedlam as happy crowds celebrate victory over Nipponese. Another round of celebrations swept the state after the formal Japanese surrender on September 2, 1945. Over the following months, servicemen and servicewomen returned home, many military bases were deactivated, and Floridians could reflect on their wartime achievements while looking forward to post-war prosperity. War heroes. 7 adopted or native Floridians received the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for heroism. They were Army Air Force 2nd Lieutenant Robert E. Famewear of Jacksonville, Army 2nd Lieutenant Alexander Sandy Nininger of Fort Lauderdale, Navy Pilot Commander David McCampbell of West Palm Beach, Army Air Force Major Thomas B. McGuire of Sebring, Marine Private Robert M. McTurius of Altoona, Army Private James H. Mills of Fort Meade, and Army First Lieutenant Cecil H. Bolton of Crawfordville. Of the 7 men listed above, only Bolton, McCampbell, and Mills survived the war. Two other Florida heroes deserve particular attention. Captain Colin P. Kelly Jr. of Madison, Florida died just 3 days after the American entry into World War II. He became a symbol of American resistance during the early days of the conflict. Kelly was the pilot of a B-17 bomber stationed in the Philippines. Kelly and his crew were on a mission to bomb the Japanese battleship Haruna. After dropping their payload, a Japanese fighter attacked and damaged Kelly's plane. Kelly ordered his crew to bail out, and remained in the cockpit until the entire crew escaped. But Kelly was unable to exit the plane before it collided with the Pacific. Kelly would posthumously receive the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions that day. Monticello resident and U.S. Marine Sergeant Ernest Boots Thomas led the patrol that planted the first American flag on Iwo Jima's Mount Suribachi during the ferocious battle of early 1945. This achievement was overshadowed by a second, highly publicized flag raising later the same day. In the vicious fighting that followed on Iwo Jima, Thomas was killed in action. His family later received the Navy Cross awarded for his service. During the war, a number of the members of the Florida legislature joined the U.S. military. A notable example was Speaker of the House Dan McCarty, who went on to achieve a distinguished combat record as a U.S. Army officer involved in the Allied invasion of southern France. How World War II changed Florida. Casualties. By war's end, over 4,600 Floridians had died in military service, with battle deaths numbering 3,086. Thousands more were wounded in action or captured by enemy forces, with many of the seriously wounded suffering permanent disabilities. Army dead from Florida numbered 3,540 of all causes, with 1,971 killed in action or died of wounds. Naval combat fatalities numbered 1,115. Nationally, wartime death totaled 405,399 servicemen and servicewomen from all causes, with 291,557 battle deaths. These figures made World War II the second deadliest conflict in American history. The Second World War marked the emergence of Florida as a modern, influential state. The conflict spurred economic development and led to a post-war population surge. The 29th most populous state in 1940, Florida now ranks third behind California and Texas. The war brought increased development and prosperity to both rural and urban areas and hastened the demands of women and minority groups for greater economic and political opportunities. Many black Floridians would later play a major role in the civil rights movement. Women, afforded more opportunities during the war, also pushed for equal rights at home and in the workforce. While many of the bases established during the war were deactivated at the end of the conflict, the military maintained facilities at a number of locations. Many military airfields were transferred to local government control and became civilian airports, some of which are still in operation today. After the war, the Army began testing an American version of the German V-1 rocket, known as the JB-2. This continued long after the war at airfields of the Florida Panhandle. By 1950, rocket testing was moved to Cape Canaveral. This program would one day play a vital role in the formation of NASA. Many veterans who had trained in Florida returned to live in the state after the war. The GI Bill brought affordable higher education to veterans and contributed to the rapid post-war expansion of Florida's higher education system. With peacetime prosperity, Florida's tourist industry also continued to expand. World War II changed Florida by setting the stage for the rapid modernization that transformed it from a rural backwater into a modern dynamic one. Floridians today can look back with pride on the accomplishments and sacrifices made during World War II and look forward to the dreaded challenges and opportunities facing the state in the future.